The following is a production of Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution.
And I want to welcome you to the Science Made Public Lecture Series. This is the 9th year we've done this. It's been phenomenal, and it's a great opportunity for me to meet new people that are interested in WHOI and for you out there to come and learn more about us. So starting out, I wanted to let you know how you can learn more about Woods Hole Oceanographic. Some of you were walking in, I had already had it set up, but for those of you who haven't, we have a raffle today, and it's a t-shirt that Bruce is modeling for us, and also a book called Down to Sea for Science. And the sign up for the raffle is a form where you can sign up for our Oceanus magazine for free, which comes out monthly. It's a way for you to learn more about Woods Hole Oceanographic. And we also have an electronic newsletter. The electronic newsletter also comes out, comes out monthly. Oceanus comes out weekly. And you can get these things free and learn about public events like this, also expeditions that are on the web, and other public events that we do here at the Oceanographic. I wanted to let people know that the Science Made Public Lecture Series is a way for you to learn what you can do at the Oceanographic, which includes the Ocean Science Exhibit Center, which is open Monday through Fridays, 11 to 4. And we hope you'll have the opportunity to visit us. And we have a brand new exhibit there on the Remus Shark Cam. So that's just a great, fun new piece that we have there. And the last bit of business before our talk, I think we want to be courteous to our speaker and to each other, so please silence your cell phones. So today I would like, did you do yours, Bruce?
I'm working on it.
Okay, good. Okay. So today I'd like to welcome Bruce Strickrott, who is the Alvin Group Manager, and he is going to be doing our Science Made Public, Humans in the Deep Ocean, From Imagination to Reality. Thanks, Bruce.
So we kind of got started here a little earlier, which is good, so I get a feel for where everybody's from. And I'll tell you a little bit about myself real quick. I've been with the Alvin program for 18 years. And like anybody else in the program, I started as a tech. I have an engineering degree, but everybody gets hired on, and we actually work with the vehicle for about 2 years and work your way into becoming a pilot. And I was a pilot. I'm still a pilot, but I was a pilot out on the ship up until recently, and then I've just been promoted to taking over the lead. And a couple of years ago, I got invited to talk to a group of tech kids, and they asked me to talk about technology, and I started looking into this and asked some questions, and one of the ones I asked myself was, how did we get to where we are today? And I started doing some research, and I learned some interesting things, and it really kind of worked into this presentation that I'm going to show you. So that's the premise. It's how did we get to where right now, for instance, at this minute, there's 3 people sitting in Alvin on the bottom of the ocean working. How did we get there? And the history is the fun part. And when you look at the history of the last 50 years with unique submersibles, we're not really talking about the big ones, but we're talking about these special use subs. You go back to Trieste, which is in the late 50s. This is Trieste. And we've been exploring only for about 50 years with people. There were some advances before that, but we're talking about free-ranging submarines. But the technology has really moved quite quickly in the last 50 years. So you guys might know of this. I put this in here. This is Jim Cameron's sub, which actually is parked across the street. And that's a little bit of an example of some of the cool things that people are doing today to get in the water with people. This is a Ben Franklin. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. This is Alvin in the 60s. This is a good picture because you can see what it used to look like, and you'll get a chance to see what it looks like today. They look similar. They're not quite the same. Here we are today. This is a picture looking at the front of the vehicle right as it's sitting on the surface. So the question that goes back to where did it all start? And I've thrown a lot of artwork that I took off the internet that's associated with a lot of sort of the imaginations of artists that conceived of doing these things, because I think it really is a good way to get a sense for what people were sort of conceiving of once upon a time. So here's our fella, Jules Verne. I think he's a good example of someone who was sort of a visionary. 1869, he writes 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And at the time, you can imagine this is a popular book, and it really caught the imagination of the people around the world to start thinking about how to do things underwater with people. So he really was sort of, I'm sure people had conceived of it, but he really brought it into the mainstream. His imagination and vision inspired people to actually start doing these things. This is an example of where fiction is driving reality. And how do we get from his sort of vision, here's the giant squid attacking, and we all dream of viewports that big. We don't have them, unfortunately. I could go without the squid. To where we are today. And this is a picture of Alvin hanging off the back of the mothership Atlantis earlier this year when we were doing sea trials. So he might have been inspired, this is what I found doing history, by earlier designs of submarines. So this is 1869 he wrote the book, but there were things going on well before he ever wrote his novel. Each of these images, by the way, are real images of vehicles that people either conceived of or actually built. And if you ever do any of the history yourself, you'll take a look at some of these things and you'll ask yourself the question, would you ever get in them? Because I honest to God, some of them I look at and I'm like, I don't know. And to put it in perspective, I've done over 300 dives in Alvin, and I'm very comfortable in there. But some of these things, this one in particular. So in 1620, this guy, Cornelius Drebbel, he's a man that's credited with building the first true submersible. He was an inventor, a scientist, he was an engineer. There's a crater on the moon named after him. He did some work with improving microscopes and telescopes. But he was also an alehouse proprietor. So I can just imagine he and his buddy sitting around drinking a couple of beers, having this idea, and he comes up with this idea, hey, I'm going to go build this thing. And this is what it looked like. Well, he's credited with design and manufacture of the first submarine. Snappy dresser, too. This is what one of his submarines looked like. In essence, it was two rowboats that were basically glued together. Yeah, pretty bold. Wood, leather, copper, real high-tech stuff, right? And it was powered by people. They rowed it underwater. They couldn't see much. They probably had a little primitive compass. I believe they had a snorkel to the surface, but what's interesting was he actually built the last one. Look how many people were in this thing. And he exhibited to the King of England. This is in the 1600s, mind you, right? He was the first to use a crude atmosphere system. He actually produced oxygen by heating a chemical. And ironically, it also took some of the CO2 out of the atmosphere. So he did some pretty innovative things. I think a lot of it was sort of seat of the pants. 3 hours underwater, 5 meters, which doesn't sound like a lot, but think about it. Back then, that was pretty deep. 20 kilometers. They rowed this thing back and forth, right? I can just imagine what it was like in there. But in the 1600s, that's a really impressive achievement. Now, they didn't go very far with it. They didn't do much with it. But I can just imagine them all sitting around the edge, looking at him climb in there, thinking, In the 1700s, late 1700s, Robert Fulton. Who knows who Robert Fulton is? Okay, so he's a little bit famous, but not for this. He came over to the States and did some pretty cool things. He built the first submarine called the Nautilus. So you can imagine that Jules Verne might have pulled the name Nautilus from Fulton's design. This is a drawing that he created of the thing. This is what it looked like on the inside. Notice the big hand crank. Here it is. Wood, copper, looks familiar. Big propeller. The sail was used on the surface. So they actually sailed this thing around when they had to. Built for the French Navy. There's the sail, 4 knots. So imagine cranking that thing fast enough to move at 4 knots underwater, right? 8 meters, 5 hours. Probably couldn't see much. Not very comfortable. So these were primitive designs, and they sort of pushed people into actually trying it to prove they could get done. Limited by the design, such that they were human-powered. You couldn't see anything. Probably just went by compass, right? And, if you bumped into something, you'd turn and go the other way. Not much in the way of knowing what your atmosphere. In Alvin, knowing about your atmosphere is everything about safety, right? They probably just hung out till they started getting a headache. And that was, time to go up, right? Crude underwater navigation didn't have anything near what we have now. Couldn't go very deep. Little regard for passenger safety. Probably why that alehouse thing came in, right? Quick, have a couple more beers. So in the 1800s, things really kind of took off. People started to see some value, particularly with military defense. And these are the pictures I was telling you about. Now, these are real. Like, look at this thing. I don't think I'd get in there. I mean, I'd climb in on deck, but I don't know about underwater. Have you heard of the Hunley? So the Hunley's very famous. He's raising his hand up. The Hunley was starting to look like a real submarine. You can see how the design is changing, and they're starting to learn a thing or two, right? 1863, built for the Confederate Navy. Great picture, right? Steel, it's got this big thing out front. First to sink a warship. So this is an achievement. This is the Confederate Navy, mind you, right? And you can imagine from the opposite side, all of a sudden there's this invisible thing that can sink a warship. That's pretty impressive. That's quite a threat. However, they went with it. Yeah, so they were able to kill themselves in the process, right? I'm sure there was a lot of flag waving. And the incredible thing was they convinced the second group of guys to get in there. I would love to have seen that conversation. Oh, it's going to be fine. As funny as that sounds, but they just recovered the submarine. It's in a museum, and they recovered the bodies and gave them a full military burial. But to its credit, it started to show what could be done with these things. And at the time, that's pretty much where the technology was headed. It was headed toward military use. 20th century, this is when things really take off. World War I, big submarine technology advancements. They wanted to go deeper. They wanted to do it more often, more reliably. But even with some of the advances they made, this is the Nautilus. This is the first nuclear-powered submarine being launched. 1954. So you can see we're hitting the 50s. Things are starting to move along. And if you think about it, right, if you look at that other submarine, the Hunley, it wasn't that long before this. And look how different things have gone, right? Now they've got a nuclear-powered submarine that can go underwater for months. But it could only go to 700 feet. So it's still limited in how deep it could go. So imagine the ocean, how big and how deep it is, and then imagine only being able to see the first 700 feet. So in the 50s, this is where Trieste comes along. This is Trieste. It's an innovative and interesting design. What you're looking at here, in 1960, she's the first one to take people down to the bottom of the deepest part of the ocean. Marianas Trench. We're going to get back to the technology in the sub here in a second. This is right near Guam, and the deepest part is the Challenger Deep, named after the sailing ship that found out how deep it was. This is also why the Cameron sub's called the Deep Sea Challenger. That's where he went back to. So here's the fellow who designed and built it. Auguste Piccard did some amazing things. He went really high in balloons, and he went really deep. Well, he got his son to go down to the bottom. But it was a blimp, effectively. So that big bag that you see is full of aviation fuel. And aviation fuel doesn't compress, and it happens to be lighter in water, so it functions like a blimp. Just works underwater instead of in the air, right? They were down in this little steel sphere. This is a great image of what it looked like. And it was really ungainly. It was hard to move around. You couldn't transport it. And then there was that whole don't smoke near it thing, right? You know? And this is the 60s, so everybody smoked, right? And this is what it looked like on the inside. There's some great backstories. Don Walsh is a really interesting man to talk to. And you know, he was the only American to go down that deep until just recently. But 35,814 feet is taller than Mount Everest, is significantly taller than the mountain. And just imagine, if you take that divided by 33 feet and realize that every 33 feet you double the you add an atmosphere to where you're headed. This is a pretty impressive achievement. And in 50 years, no one had gone back there until just recently. March 26 is when the Challenger went down. And that's a whole other topic. That submarine in itself is really interesting to look at and talk about, but we're not really going to get into that too much. But right after Trieste, things really started to move along. The French built Sienna, and this is a scientific submersible. Things really started to go toward doing science. 3,000 meters deep. That's pretty significant. 3 people, 2 viewports. The mission duration is 3 days, but they wouldn't stay down that long. They had enough life support to do 3 days. They'd probably stay down for about 6 to 8 hours total. Ben Franklin, this is an interesting submarine. Could go to 2,000 feet, carry 6 people in that tiny little thing. It was a tube, basically. 29 viewports. Could stay down for 30 days. That's what it looked like inside. Not very roomy. Imagine 6 people in there for a month. And they did it. So in 1969, they spent 30 days floating along the Gulf Stream. And what's interesting is that they did it at the same time people were walking on the moon for the same time, so no one paid any attention. You know, they were probably like, hey, stupid moon. This is Illuminaut. Illuminaut has some intertwining history with Alvin. We won't get into that, but Illuminaut, and Barry Walden, by the way, is sitting in here, so if I get anything wrong, just throw something at me, right? Barry, by the way, ran the Alvin Group for years and years, and he's going to know all the things I get wrong. But Illuminaut was built by Reynolds Aluminum, could go to 40 to 500 meters, is a pretty significant submarine. 4 viewports, and you could walk around in the thing. It's in a museum somewhere. It's a really amazing machine, but it wasn't very maneuverable. It was big. It had a lot of good things to it, but it wasn't the right one to do the kind of work that people need to do. But in all cases, if you look at them, you can see where things have really moved on, right? They've improved the ability to go deep by advancing the way they make the hulls. Manipulators, this is a big deal. Right now they can actually interact with what's going on outside, take samples, and grab things. And the ability to look out, that was a big deal. The ability to look out the window. Now this is from a tourist submarine. It doesn't go very deep, right? That's the kind of window that we'd love to have when we go deep, but the physics are pretty impressive. But that's a heck of a view right there. So in the early 60s, Alvin, this is Alvin as a young man, probably on the original Atlantis, which was a sailing ship, and he's got some interesting looking device. He was one of the leaders that conceived of building Alvin effectively. This is the original concept drawing of the thing. They were going to call it CPUP, which I'm glad they didn't. I think Alvin's a much more catchier name. But it was more or less named after Alan Vine. So the name Alvin is an acronym of sorts. And I know there's more to that story, but I wasn't able to get it out of his wife. She told me that she just wasn't going to tell me. I tried. 1964 it was commissioned. That's the year I was born, so we're about the same age. What's key here when you look at this is look at the picture of the submarine in 1964, and as you see the pictures change, watch the design evolve. And I think that's one of the nicest things about the submarine. It is an example of an evolving design, and you can see that in the pictures. So right off the bat, this is late 60s. This is in Florida, I suspect. You can already see some things changing. There's a big prop on the back of the submarine. We don't have that any longer. This is a picture of Alvin with the original support ship Lulu, which is in the background. Not a very high-tech platform. You can't see it, but there's tubes underwater. That's where the folks that were on there lived. They have very interesting stories about what that was like. Barry, you were on there, right? If you dropped a tool, you didn't have the tool. It was gone. And they would occasionally carry another ship along that they called the hotel ship, so the scientists would get the good living on the big ship and have the nice food, and the Alvin techs would be squirreled away on this platform. But again, you can see the design evolving. In this picture, there's still the big prop in the back and the 2 lift props on the side. There's not a lot of lighting or cameras out front. It's pretty clean. There wasn't a lot of high-tech stuff going on with images back then. That's why the viewports were very important at that time. Here you can see there's more equipment out front. You can't see in this picture, but the big prop is off the back. This is probably from the late mid to late 80s. Originally, this is a picture of the original steel sphere that was put in the submarine in the 60s. That sphere was eventually removed and became another submarine. We'll talk about that in a second. But how many of you have seen this picture before? All right, so this picture is, imagine if you will, that's the port viewport, and that's a swordfish. So at some point during this dive, the port observer had a visitor who got stuck. And they brought it aboard. And hey, if you're going to catch a fish, why not, right? And they ate it. I would. But this picture has lived on. It's probably one of the most impressive because it's so unique. But these fish are aggressive and they're not little. So just imagine what it was like to be that port observer looking out the window and see this very angry, big thing thrashing. Actually, there's a guy sitting in the audience right now, Tony Tarantino. He's the only other sub-pilot that I know of that's been attacked by a swordfish. A littler one, but it attacked the swordfish. The swordfish attacked it, and it broke its bill. And we have video of the crabs consuming the unlucky, unwise swordfish. So in the 1970s, the steel sphere came off, and it went and became the submersible Turtle, which is down in the museum in Mystic, Connecticut. So if you ever go down there and you see Turtle, you're really seeing Alvin 1. Kind of repackaged. The new titanium hull came along in the 70s, and that was a hull that I worked with for most of my career. And it had deep. It allowed us to go a lot deeper. This is the first woman to ever dive in Alvin. This is a great picture of her. And that may not sound like a big deal today, but imagine the advances in science and the ability of women to really be a part of that. Here's Alvin allowing that and enabling that as well. And so I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. Propulsion was updated in the 80s. It made it more maneuverable. About every 5 years, the sub will come back and we'll go through these upgrades where we make improvements. And again, this is an example of an evolving design. As a new technology comes on, we like to slap it on Alvin. It's sort of a mechanism to try new things. This is a picture of the sub just before we took it apart in 2011. And both Tony and I spent most of our careers diving in that vehicle. And it was a blast. It really was a joy to fly that thing around. These pictures were taken off Galapagos where the water is really clear. So this is a good opportunity to see what it looked like as it's on its way down here. You can tell it's descending because you can see all the bubbles that are coming out. This is a CGI image that we pulled off of a movie we made, but I thought it was a really good way to show you what it's like down there, how we configure the submarine, how we fly it around on the surface. Just above the bottom, this is what the lava looks like. In this particular image, we had the submarine configured for lots of lighting so we could do really good filming. But that's about what our day-to-day is. You get down to the bottom and you get near it, and then you hover above it and you fly around, you do your work, and occasionally you'll land. When you talk to the folks that are on the bottom today, they will be parked on the bottom at a wellhead, which is hard to describe, but it's basically a platform. And they're going to be resting there they're taking data and interacting with sensors that are in this thing. But they're parked inside this tiny little submarine on the bottom. So that's where we left off in 2011, and we brought the submarine back, and we took it apart. There's a great time-lapse on the Hui website that shows us tearing it apart. And there's a time-lapse of us building a new one. And bear in mind that it takes us only about 2 weeks to take it apart. It took us over a year and a half to put it back together again. So the disassembly is the easy part, right? And parts go everywhere, and then by the end of it all, you're looking around going, where does this go? So one of the things we do is we take lots of pictures of it coming apart. But this is images of the new hull we'll talk about in a second going together as we started to build the thing. And again, this was over about almost 2 years. This is the final configuration of the new vehicle. You already saw the one picture of it. And if you look closely, you can kind of see some of the changes. Some of them are subtle. And even the most subtle changes are the ones that are the most significant. Here's that picture of us hanging off the back end of the ship in the end of last year when we did sea trials off San Diego. So what did we do? Well, the biggest thing we did was we replaced the hull. And we'll get into that in a second. But we also upgraded The propulsion is all now digital, and the submarine has an extra thruster, so you can do all sorts of fun stuff with it that you never could. I've been in this, and it's fun. It takes a little getting used to, but it can do things that we couldn't do with the old sub. You can drive sideways, you can spin around, plus you can incrementally tell it how to move on a computer, and it'll move all by itself. All the video on the sub, for the most part, that's used by science is high def. All that high def video is going through fiber optics to the hull, so that we have real high quality video. The whole computer command system has changed. All the lights are LED now, so they're smaller, less power. They give a lot of light, and we can put 36 lights on the front of the thing and really blast a lot of light out, which can be good. We don't always need that much. Sometimes when you're down there, it's like driving in a snowstorm. So having all that light isn't always needed, but occasionally when you really want it, you can fire them all up. We've got the extra thruster. Most of the foam is new. The sub has the capability to go a lot deeper now. We're not there yet because of other reasons, but all of the new equipment, about 60% of the submarine, can go down to almost 22,000 feet. So this is the centerpiece of what we did. And I remember, this is a joke I like to tell. Barry, you might like this. When I first started, which was in 1996, I was at a meeting, and Barry started talking about building a new submarine. And I was sitting there thinking, boy, this is going to be cool. And I said, someone should have leaned over and said, we'll get a new sub when you're expedition leader. Which, it's a tongue-in-cheek joke if you don't know what it means. But it took that long to get from the concept through the design all the way to the point where we actually had the hull in hand. This particular hull was made in the United States, across the country, partly in Wisconsin and partly out in LA. And the folks that designed and built it were out of San Antonio, Texas. This is what it looked like once upon a time before it became a hull. It was a big disc of titanium, heated bright orange and getting squished over and over until it was ready to get pressed. So that red thing with the flames coming out of it, that's half of the hull getting ready to be pressed, and kabang. And the video of it's impressive because it goes real fast. And you only get one chance. And when they pull them out, it's this glowing goblet. So that thing that you see there is now half of what the folks are sitting in. Now, needless to say, it doesn't look that crude. But I always like to make the point that this is titanium, which sounds like a magic thing, right? But it's really not. Someone went out, figured out where they could find the right rock, dig it out of the ground, mess with it, beat it a little bit, heat it up, and then whammo, you got a submarine. So here's the two halves of the hull were put together. They were rolled into this vacuum chamber. This is out in LA. And rather than hand welding it, they basically shot an electron beam through the thing. And they welded it. And the primary weld, which basically fuses the two pieces together, took a matter of minutes to do. Now, all the post-weld work took a lot longer. But to put in perspective, the old hull, I think, was hand welded and probably took months to make. This took years to make, but the weld itself took minutes, and they only really had one chance. So they had to get it right, and they weren't going to do it again. If they screwed up, that would have been it. We wouldn't be showing these neat pictures right now. So here's the hull when it was pretty much finished. This is out in LA. We went out and saw it. The wide-angle lens makes it look bigger, but I will tell you the windows are bigger, and this is one of those big upgrades. When all was said and done, when they measured this thing, it had to be within 1/8 of an inch of being perfectly spheroid other than where the windows are. It was within about 10% of that. That's how well they made this. This is probably one of the largest, most perfect spheres ever made on the planet. And this is a great picture because you can see the old hull and the new hull. And you can see the differences where the windows were a lot smaller. We've got 3 up front where we used to have 1. There's a story behind that dog, by the way. So here's what it looked like once upon a time in there when everything was black and white, right? And here's where we are today. So this is looking forward from the upper right corner, so to speak, of where the framework is, looking down toward the front. You can see the 3 large windows, and you can see the 2 side windows. So there's 5 usable viewports right now. There were only 3 usable ones in the past. They were a lot smaller. These are 7-inch windows. You can actually get your face in them. And it does make a big difference. And the funny thing is that for those of us that were driving the old submarine, where all the work was done out of the front for us, when we first started doing this one, we just automatically started doing work out the front windows. And then we realized, wait a minute. We'll go over there on those side ones, these big side ones. And it's really made it a lot easier to do the work. What you're looking at here, by the way, these 3 screens are touch screens. So a lot of the interface with the equipment, with the science gear, with the lights, propulsion, is digital. So if you want to command the sub to do something, you reach up and you initiate it through a touch on the screen. There's a lot of things in here you can't see. That I'm looking at one of the monitors that has all the video coming in on high def, so you can see all the outside cameras inside. Right on that flat portion underneath the front window is a high def video monitor. The pilot can see all the video coming in. This is Sea Trials off San Diego. So this is we still use the same ship that we've operated since 1997. We had to do some upgrades to the launching platform, but ultimately we ended up with we had these fairly rigid design constraints, and in the long run we were able to meet them. And the sub is still usable on the same ship. It's a little bit bigger, takes up a little more space in the hangar, but all in all it's pretty good. Here's the image again of the front of the submarine. 3 big windows that you can look out of. If you look right above these windows, you can see these little, what looks like a gumball, clear gumball. Those are high-def cameras that are on gimbaled Panatilts that you can control from inside the submarine. So each of the scientists gets to control one of those, and they can move this camera around and point it at things. You can't see it above there. There's 2 more that are similar. So each scientist gets 2 cameras they can move around, plus they get their 2 windows to look out of. The 2 manipulators that you see here, the claws that we use, they are on gimbaled mounts that can now move. They used to be fixed in place and would only rotate around where they were attached. And now you can take that whole base and spin it all the way backwards. So the range of motion of these arms is significantly improved. This is the only shot I have right now that's reasonable of it underwater on the way down. And this is off California. You notice the water's not nearly as clear as it was in Galapagos. So I'm waiting to go back to Galapagos and take some really good pictures. That'll be my excuse. So 50 years. And this is remarkable. If you think about Apollo, and you think about Gemini, and you think about all the space program that were, on average, maybe 10 years, right? Alvin's one of the few vehicles of any kind, frankly, for science that's still going after 50 years. And if you think about what we've achieved with the new sub, it's highly likely we could do it for another 50. Ultimately, that's our goal, is to continue this and hand it off to people so that they can continue to upgrade and improve it. But the hull itself has got an easy 30 to 50-year lifespan. So to kind of wrap this up, because we're getting close to the call, I like to focus on the fact that if you look at history with science and technology in particular, you'll see that people were dreaming of things. So Jules Verne's dreaming about people going underwater, doing these fun things. And if you've ever seen the Disney movie, they're marching around. If you've ever seen the movie, some of it's kind of painful because they're like grabbing onto the sea turtle and they're cromping over the reef. But the idea was that they were, he was conceiving of people functioning and doing things underwater. And that was a dream. Imagine if he could see this now, right? What would he think? Someone once asked me if I was going to take anybody in the submarine, who would I take? And I got a long list, but he's pretty much at the top. Because I'd like to just blow him away, be like, oh yeah, check this out, right? So we've gone through this history where people would do things like have a beer and then build a couple of rowboats and convince their buddies to get in it and go 20 miles. To somebody thinking, how do you go to the bottom of the ocean? And someone says, I know, let's make a blimp. Through to, this is a picture of Alvin in the 70s. This is Project Famous, where I think this is one of the first images with the new hull. Barry, you might be able to correct me on that, but it's rare we get to dive with other submarines, by the way, so these pictures are few and far between, and I really hope we get that chance again. But, and what's interesting, this is the very first manipulator Alvin had. It was this crazy electric thing, and I think it used to be up in the museum. They had one arm, it was slow, and now look at where we're at. And of all the people I meet that were in the Alvin program, I'd love to go back and meet some of them when they first started and show them what they were going to end up with. And this is what it's going to be in the year 2014. And this is one of the coolest things. So here's something that Jules Verne wrote, and I think it's very appropriate. He said that anything one man can imagine, other men can make real, which I think was fairly prescient, right? So I've actually got a T-shirt with that on it, and I've worn it in the submarine because I thought that that was appropriate. And I think it makes a big point here. So for everybody in here that's young, I'm talking teenagers or younger, remember that Alvin was made the year I was born. And at one point in time when I was a kid, I was looking at a geographic and I was paging through it, and I saw all these great pictures of Alvin discovering hydrothermal vents, and in my mind I was like, that's really cool. And I never really thought that would be what I was doing. But here I am standing here telling you that that's what I do for a living. I've actually gotten lucky enough to have someone pay me to climb into a submarine and go see cool things, right? So we've just built this brand new submarine, so every one of you here, you could come and do this job. You just have to study engineering and deal with math teachers that don't teach well. But what's critical here is that it's people that have vision that make things happen, right? So if you have dreams in your mind of anything, it's unusual. That's what it takes to get to being able to have someone pay you to do fun things like drive submarines. And I threw this up here. I think this is a good segue. Tony, were you there? So we had just finished a cruise to San Francisco. And I love this story because we were having the couple beers, just, kind of celebrating the fact that we had a successful cruise. And in walks this fellow, his young kid, and his mom, and he's making balloon hats to make money for college. Right? And balloon hats, balloon hats, big whoop, right? So I pulled out a picture of Alvin and I went, how about that? So $40 later, we had the one and only Alvin balloon hat, so to speak. And that thing, it lasted for like 3 weeks. But that's impressive. I didn't think it would be that good, but he did a great job. And he did it in like 2 minutes flat. Right? So we'll take a break. We're almost perfect on time. In about a few minutes, we're going to get a phone call from the ship. To give you an example of how something as simple as a machine can inspire people, this is just a handful of the stamps that are out there that are available for different things. And each one of them has a sub on it, right? So here's a machine that people have put all their time and energy into. I swear if it could talk, it's a thing. It's very high maintenance. It's got an attitude problem. But it's also all over stamps. My favorite one is the one from the Republic of Congo. When you make Congo, I think you've made a statement, right? and they decided that we needed to have a green sail, which I think is pretty neat. What else could I tell you? There's all sorts of fun stuff about Alvin out there, but all right, here we go. This is who we're going to be speaking with in a few minutes. Ken, who's the pro on this phone? If I touch it, I swear it's going to explode. This is where the Atlantis is. You can see that where the start of their trip is Astoria, Oregon. Anybody from Oregon here? Nobody that far right now, huh? They departed a week and a half ago. Okay, good. And headed out to where they're working right now. Andy Fisher is from UC Santa Cruz. We talked about the banana slugs. Andy's a great guy to work with. He, by the way, Andy is an ODP Ocean Drilling Program scientist. And here's a fellow who knows a lot about drilling holes in the bottom of the ocean. And he's an enjoyable guy to work with. Phil Fort is the pilot today. Phil's been with the Alvin Group on and off for almost as long as I have. He was with the ROV Jason for a number of years and worked as a Jason pilot. And right now he's we bring him in as a mercenary occasionally when we need pilots. So he's in there right now as the pilot in command. Keir Becker is from the University of Miami. I've worked with Keir for years. Great guy. Actually, he invited me down and I spoke at the Rosenthal School. And then Everett Omori will be an interesting person to talk to because today's his very first dive in the submarine. Both Andy's on the ship right now, by the way. These three on the right are the folks that are in the submarine. And Keir has had a number of dives over the years. He's actually had dives before I was with the program. So Everett's probably having a great day. And how many of you have been watching this internet meme with the ice bucket challenge? Are you guys all familiar with this thing that's going on? So there's a tradition when you come out of the submarine on your first dive, there's a bucket of ice waiting for you. it's something that's voluntary, but it's kind of fun, right? And I would kind of wonder if someone on board hasn't linked the two together yet, right? So it'll be interesting to talk to Everett and see what he has to say. So when we get started, we're going to have a little bit of a conversation with Andy. He's going to tell us a little bit about the cruise, what they've been doing. Yesterday was a day that they didn't even think they were going to dive today. They thought the weather was going to be too dicey to get in. Yesterday they called the dive because the winds and seas were too high. And luckily enough today, they were able to get in. So my assumption is that they're still there. If the weather got bad.
Can you tell us how the phone would work?
Okay, yeah. So the ship is calling us because it's the easiest way to set this up. They'll be calling from a place that we call the top lab, which is an area just after the bridge. It's up high on the ship. It's where one of the folks in the Alvin Group sits during the day, standing watches, and we were always up there. We communicate with the sub. And it's where like I said, they'll be calling us from a regular phone. It's a sat phone, so it's like any phone. It's what we call full duplex, which means that you can talk to each other at the same time. To talk to the submarine, we use a device that we call it's called the EDO. That's the brand name, and it's essentially the same as a radio, except it's using sound waves to carry your voice rather than radio waves. And like any radio, you can only speak in one direction. Here they go. Hello.
Yeah, good morning. This is, or good afternoon. This is Atlanta Stop Lab calling in.
Hi, Pat. Hey, it's Bruce, and I'm at the Redfield Auditorium, and we're expecting your call. We just finished showing some pictures of the sub, and I thought when you get a chance, maybe you and Andy can tell us what's going on out there before we talk to the sub.
Okay, well, I'll hand over to Andy right now, and he can give you the lowdown on the operation, and then we'll transfer to the sub. Do be advised that the transmission down to the sub through the phone isn't great, so need you to speak slow and clear. Transmission up is loud and clear, but we're having a little bit of a problem with it this morning.
Okay, roger that.
So here's Andy. We're in 1362A. There's no place here. This is Andy Fisher. I'm a professor of Earth and Planetary Sciences at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and I'm calling in from the top lab on the Atlantis.
Hi, Andy. This is Bruce. How you doing?
Hey, we're doing really well, Bruce. How are you guys?
We're good. We've got a room full of people here that are listening to you, and we've got your smiling mug up on the screen, so they know what you look like.
Yeah.
And we were talking about banana slugs a little while ago. So, hey, Andy,
what can I tell you about?
well, I think can you just give us a rundown of what the cruise is about, what your goals are, and how the diving's been going?
Yes. So this is a project that's been running in one form or another really since the late 90s. We've been involved, a number of us out here have been involved in projects where we've drilled holes in the seafloor using a drill ship as part of the originally part of the ocean drilling program, now part of the integrated ocean drilling program. It's an international scientific research program that drills holes in the seafloor, collects samples, and installs instruments. And for this project, we've installed a series of wells that penetrate up to 600 meters beneath the seafloor, and then they're lined with metal casing. Some of the holes are open at the bottom, others are closed off, or they have casing that's got holes in it so you can communicate with the formation below. The formation below is the volcanic ocean crust. It's made of the salt and the rock that you see on the island of Hawaii or in the Columbia River basin area. That's what the volcanic upper crust is made of. It's covered by sediment in most places like it is out here. And these holes in the seafloor penetrate through the sediment and are open in the basement rocks below, the volcanic rocks. And then we have instruments hanging inside the holes. We have fluid samplers and pressure gauges, temperature sensors, and special growth chambers for microbial study. These are little chambers that have rocks and minerals put down, and they allow microbes to grow. We pull those back out, and microbiologists can find out which kind of microorganisms live deep below the seafloor in the ocean crust, and what they do for a living, how they fix carbon, how they make energy. And what's really exciting about this is we're doing all the work in the same place at the same time. We're studying the chemistry, the microbiology, the geophysics, the temperature conditions, the fluid flow through the ocean crust, all happening in the same place at the same time. Well, these systems, they keep monitoring, they keep sampling, they keep measuring when we're not here. And then we get out here every year, every 2 years, and we go to the seafloor and we connect up to the systems, and we're able to download data, collect samples, do experiments within the sealed boreholes, and then get everything set up and leave it for another year or two, and then come back again after that. So these observatory systems are kind of a constant presence in this area, and the vehicle Alvin lets us get back to them and lets us get the data and the samples that are so critical to the experiment.
So, Andy, most folks here have never been on a ship that goes out and does science. Can you kind of give us a rundown of what it's like to be out there on a given day? Maybe, you know, from a day that we do Alvin operations, or maybe a day where we're not diving due to weather, but science is still going on? Absolutely. So the Atlantis is about 300 feet long. There's something like 55 or 60 people on board. There's officers and crew that help to keep the ship running. There's a team of about 10 people who are just dedicated to maintaining the submersible. There are pilots and the technicians, the expedition leader who helps us with planning. And the day, well, it kind of starts the night before as we get our gear ready. Some of these instruments that we use are things we've been working on for years, building back home at our labs, or things we've had engineered and built for our use. But we bring them out to the ship, and sometimes for a week in advance or days in advance we're getting the gear ready. And then the night before we have to get everything rigged up on the submersible. And the pilots and the expedition leader and the technicians, they help us to make sure that our equipment is ready to go and is configured properly on the submersible, that we have the right power, that we have the right weight. We get everything rigged as best we can the night before. We definitely need to have things set up by about 6 a.m. the day we're going to dive. On this cruise, I've been working days, so I've been getting up between 5 and 5:30, and I try to get out to take a look at the front end of the submersible by about 6 or 6:15 to make sure things are set up okay. And then the Alvin Group is super busy at that point. They're getting the submersible ready. The deck crew, they're getting the little boat ready. There's a little, like a Zodiac, an inflatable boat that they take out, because when Alvin goes in the water, there are swimmers who are in the water with the submersible helping to prepare it to launch. So it's quite an operation. That really gets underway typically right after breakfast, between 7:15, 7:30. Things get real busy, and we try to get the submersible into the water by 8 o'clock to have a full day to dive. So I'm going to open up some questions from the audience for you, Andy, and we'll work here for a few minutes, maybe up to 10 minutes, and then we'll work toward going toward the conversation with the submarine. So you guys have any question for Andy with regard to what's going on out there? Go ahead. Now's the time to ask them. Go ahead. Andy, I might have to relay these to you.
How deep is today's dive, and how long does it take to ascend and descend?
Okay, Andy, the question is how deep are they diving today, and how long is it going to take them? How long did it take them to get down, and how long will it take them to get back up? This might be partially a question for Pat.
Yeah, very good. The water depth here is about 2 miles, and it usually takes something like an hour and a half or an hour 45 minutes for the sub to dive and reach the bottom. And it usually comes up a little bit quicker than that, maybe an hour or an hour and 15 minutes to get back to the surface when the dive is done. And that's the water depth out here. We're doing all of our work on the sea floor, so the sub goes from the ship to the bottom, and then we'll get about 6 or 6.5 hours of bottom time to do our work, and then the sub comes back to the surface. And we typically try to get it up to the surface and on deck between 5 and 5:15 or 5:30 in the evening.
Anybody else? Here we go.
Have you ever found anything exceptionally bizarre on your dives?
So here's a question, Andy. First, I guess to open this up, how many dives have you had so far in Alvin?
Well, me personally, I think I've been in the sub 4 or 5 times. I was just reminiscing the other night with one of my colleagues here. The first chance I had to go in the submersible was in 1990, and that was working just offshore of Oregon, in an area where there's a lot of earthquakes and where we were doing some sediment coring. So that was my first dive. I was actually about a year out of graduate school at the time.
So the question was, have you ever found anything or seen anything exceptional or bizarre on any of your dives? Besides the parties?
Well, for somebody who's relatively, new to it, I've only been down a handful of times. It seems like we always see things that I haven't seen before. I remember one of the things that was the most striking was all of the bioluminescent organisms in the water column as the sub goes down and comes back up again. We turn the lights off and you look out through the portholes, and there's all these crazy-looking organisms that just light up in bright green as the sub goes by, and all different shapes. Some look like little jellyfish, some look like little ladders, little things that look like spiders. There's just all kinds of things in the water itself. And then when we're on the seafloor, we see a variety of things. The areas that we're working aren't super exciting geologically. These are locations where we have our boreholes, and they're kind of they're located in places that are relatively quiet. But occasionally we'll visit outcrops or other features where there's animals of different kinds. We see octopus and shrimp and sea fans and corals and other critters. They like to cluster where the ground is hard and they can make their homes. And that's always interesting to see these organisms that are on the bottom of the ocean. They've never been to the surface. You think when you're down there, you realize any individual organism, you can well be the first person to ever see it. So it's pretty exciting just to see what's down there, even if it's not, a black smoke or vent field. There's often interesting things to look at when we're doing our work.
This young guy out in the back there.
How long is the sub usually underwater?
So the question for you, Andy, is how long is the sub normally underwater? And I think you could segue to Pat there to tell him how long it can stay underwater. So for a normal day, how long do you normally stay down?
Oh, okay. Yeah, so on a normal dive, the sub might go in the water about 8 o'clock and then come back out at 5. So that's about 9 hours. But there's safety systems on board. There's lots of extra air. There's extra food. There's extra water. There's sleeping bags. And I believe the vehicle's equipped so if necessary, people could stay for 3 days if that's what was required because of weather problems or other issues. But the normal dive is just 8 hours. You go in the morning and come back out by dinner.
And if we can, we try to do that every day, right? You guys had to take yesterday off because of weather, right?
That's right. And that's not unusual. This part of the ocean, we're at about 48 north, 128 west, about 200 kilometers west of Vancouver. In this part of the ocean, you tend to get these storms that roll through every 3-4 days. In fact, the nicest days up here, it's kind of gray and drizzly. Those are the best days. In many ways, the ocean is kind of calm. And yesterday started out beautiful, clear football weather. Blue sky, stiff wind, and the seas were pretty high. So it's we're always careful with a submersible. We don't want to put it in the water. If the seas are high and the wind is high, it can make it difficult to launch and recover. Being in the water when we're diving, the weather at the surface doesn't bother us at all. The sub is quiet and stable. But getting the sub in and out of the water is a delicate operation, and we're always looking out for safety. So we watch the weather carefully, and the expedition leader makes the decision as to whether or not we can dive that day. And there was no question. It was pretty rough yesterday in the morning. So I think there was a consensus about taking that break for one day.
This gentleman right here.
What is the temperature on the bottom? How does the crew stay warm?
Okay, so here's a good one. What's the temperature on the bottom, and how does the crew stay warm, implying that it's cold in there? So I think there's two parts to this question. What's the temperature outside, and then what's the temperature inside the sub?
Right. Yeah, it's a great question. So the bottom of the ocean at significant depth is cold everywhere, and right here it's below 2 degrees Celsius. So it's just above freezing at the bottom of the ocean. And Alvin doesn't have any heaters. really. You've got all the electrical equipment inside, and that puts off heat. You've got the humans inside, they put off heat. But what happens is when you start your dive, it's a little cool initially, or it might be even warm if you're in the tropics. But as you dive down through the water column, it cools down pretty quickly. And typically, everybody who's on the dive brings extra clothing. They'll bring extra pair of pants, extra socks, a ski hat, a couple of sweaters. There's blankets down there. And as the dive goes on, people add clothing. They pull on more layers just to stay warm. By the end of the dive, it can be kind of chilly in the sub. Might be in the 50s Fahrenheit, I guess. But usually we're pretty toasty in there because everybody's brought plenty of warm clothes for the ride.
So I think we'll take one more here before we ask you guys to transfer over to the sub, if that's okay.
Okay, sure.
I'm curious how the data that you guys are collecting is shared once sort of you get back up, and if any of it is sort of widely available to the public.
Okay, this is a great question. So this question, Andy, is the data that you collect during a given dive, whether it be the data that you guys are collecting or it's part of the stuff that Alvin gets, how is that shared, and is any of it available to the public?
Yeah, it's a great question, and the answer is it's shared in many ways. I'll describe a little bit, and absolutely, this is data that's collected largely through grants that are awarded through the National Science Foundation, which is funded by the U.S. taxpayers. Some dives are funded by the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. Some are funded through the Office of Naval Research, and unless it's classified for some reason, pretty much all of the data becomes public. There's often a period where the scientists who collect it get access first. It gives us a chance to work up the results and do analyses and maybe publish some of those results. But then the data becomes public, and there's a variety of repositories. Many of them are available on the internet. There's a National Geophysical Data Center that houses a lot of the data. There's other information that's available through the Woods Hole website. You can actually get to. There's a system where you can sort of hunt through photographs that are taken on dive. It's like being inside the sub a little bit. You kind of click through an interface, and you can get to the dive photograph, and there's information on where the sub is located, and other information is posted there as well. So, yeah, we collect this data. We collect our samples in order to accomplish scientific goals, but there's this real legacy of information that is made available to essentially the whole world after a short time has gone by. Usually on the order of a year or 2 years, that information becomes available in the public domain.
So the one thing I'll add to that is that some of the dives that we've done in the past are online on a thing called the Frame Grabber, and folks can look at that and actually see images from the dives over the years. So, hey, Andy, if Pat's up for it and the sub is up for it, we're ready to switch over to talking to the folks in the sub.
Okay, well, I will pass you along. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks for taking the time to call us out here. We appreciate it, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the day. I'm going to pass you on to Pat and then down to the submersible.
All right, Andy, it was nice to talk to you again.
You as well. Take care, Bruce.
Okay, are you ready to pass through the sub?
I'm all ready. I've got a picture of the UQC up here so they can see what you're talking with and what the folks in the sub are using.
Roger that. Okay, stand by one. Alvin, Atlantis, you ready for the phone patch? Over. Atlantis, you ready for the phone patch? Over. Yeah, we're ready. We got lots of echoes, so we have to wait for the echo to go away. Okay, Bruce, you're on.
Hey, Phil, it's Bruce. How you doing down there? Over. Say again? The question was, what's happening down there? Over.
Our depth is 26 meters. We have just approached the at 1362 feet. There's an instrument here that's plugged in that takes water samples, and we're going to do work on it, finally release it.
So, hey, Phil, can you introduce who's in the submarine with you, and perhaps have one of them describe what their personal experience is today in the dive? Over.
I'll then introduce personnel in submarine and have someone describe the dive.
Let's see, we've got Keir Becker in here, Dr. Keir Becker, and we've got Everett Omori from Hawaii. And I'm going to pass the phone over to Keir, who can describe what we're doing while I continue on with approaching our next target.
Yeah, roger that. Okay, Q, could you describe what's about to happen? Over.
They were installed in 2004 and 2010, respectively, to form as part of a series of observatories on the seafloor to understand the subsea for hydrogeology. The first one, we attempted to download pressure data and put a tool into the hole to recover some instruments. At the second one, we're approaching right now a geo-micro sled and to sample for subsea for microbiology. Over.
Okay, Pat, I'm going to get some questions from the audience and send them to you. Okay? Anybody want to ask? Anybody want to talk to the submarine? We got a girl in the back here who's got her hand waving like mad.
Where do you think the best place you went was and why?
So, Pat, this is a question for Keir or for Phil. Where is the best place that they've had a dive and why? Over.
Alvin, a question from the audience for Keir Becker. Where is the best place you've had a dive and why? Over.
Probably the most memorable dives are at hydrothermal fields. My very first dive in 1982 was at the Guaymas Basin hydrothermal field, the first time I saw black smokers in person. So that's probably the most memorable of all. Over.
Okay, we're going to get another question from the audience.
We have the next.
Can you describe one animal that you've seen on this dive?
Okay, Pat, they'd like the folks in the sub to describe an animal that they've run across on today's dive. Over.
Okay, Alvin, the question is, can you describe an animal that you have run across today on today's dive? Over.
I mean, octopus.
I've seen personally one fish, and there was one soft animal that I'm not sure what it was, that basically we literally ran into. Over.
All right, we'll take another question from the audience. How about this young man in front here?
What does the seafloor look like where you are right now?
This is a good question. Pat, they would like to know, what does the seafloor look like where they're diving? Over.
Alvin, can you describe the seafloor around the wellhead? Over.
The seafloor around the wellhead is covered with sediment, and immediately around the wellhead, it's also got some of the cuttings that are flushed out of the hole as we drilled it from the drill ship over.
So there's a lot of mud.
Next question?
Next question.
A lot of mud.
My question is for Everett. Is this dive meeting his expectations?
So this is a question directly to the new diver, Everett. And the question is, has the dive met your expectations? Over.
Okay, this question is for Everett. How has the dive met your expectations? Over.
The dive has definitely far exceeded my expectations. It's a really awesome thing down here. A lot of cool things.
Nothing beats geologists for descriptions. All right, hang on. We got another question coming. Way in the back there.
When you're at these great depths, do you feel kind of far away or removed from people on the surface or kind of society, as it were?
All right, here's an interesting question, and I think this one can go to Everett too, Pat. The question is when they're down underwater in the sub, do they feel removed, so to speak, from the rest of the world or from society? Do they feel like they're all on their own down there? Over.
Okay, Alvin, another one for Everett. Do you feel removed from the world on your dive? Over. Your dive.
Yeah. Anything. It's a really unique environment. Over.
Hey, I got a couple that'll help. So, hey, Pat, I'd like to ask Everett what does he think of the lunch that's been provided for him? Can he give us a little? How does he feel about our excellent cuisine? Over. Let's see if he'll describe it.
Okay, Everett, one more time. How do you find the excellent cuisine for lunches? Over.
I haven't had my lunch yet, so no comments. Over.
He hasn't eaten yet. That tells you they're always working. Pat, I guess we'll take one more question, one or two more, and then we'll let you guys get back to work.
So some people want to know where the bathroom is, and in the event of a gas attack, where do you go?
Here we go. Here's the question, Pat. They want to know where the bathroom is, and in the, quote, event of a gas attack, end quote, what do you do? Over.
I tell you what, I'll answer that one. They're doing something right now. In the submarine, we carry something called a heater bottle, and that's commonly known as a human endurance range extender. So everybody gets one if they need it, and then if there is a gas attack, the scrubber is fitted with a activated carbon filter, and if the gas attack is bad, we will abort the dive.
So I guess, Pat, we're going to throw one more question at you guys, and if they're too busy to answer, you can answer, and then we'll let you go.
When was Everett's first dive?
Oh, so this is Everett's first dive. So here's a question. Hey, Pat, will you describe to the audience what Everett has in store for him when he comes back to the surface?
Yeah, roger that. Well, right now on the back deck are about 6 or 7 5-gallon buckets with water chilling in them. They're constantly keeping them cool with ice from our ice maker, and when he gets up, he is going to get doused.
All right, Pat, I guess we're going to sign off. Everybody here, we got one more question, one quick one.
Have you ever seen a shark?
Oh, here we go. Pat, have you ever, when you're in the submarine, have you ever come across a shark?
Yes, we have. Occasionally we do work with what's called the whale falls. A whale will die at sea, sink to the bottom, and then there are some scientists that actually go out and study the decomposition of that whale. We have been on these dives where we've been sitting there looking at the various animals and had a 5-gill or 6-gill shark come in. And they're fairly large. They're anywhere from 14 to 20 feet long, some of the big ones. And so, yeah, occasionally when you find something like that, you do occasionally see rather large sharks on the bottom.
Okay, Pat, I appreciate that. And thanks for your time. We're going to sign off. And I hope you guys have a great rest of the day and the rest of the trip. And I'll see you this weekend when I fly out there.
Yep, see you on Sunday.
All right, thanks a bunch.
Right, this is Atlantis Clear. Bye.
Yeah. So at this point, I wanted to put this picture up, by the way. When he was talking about was a whale fall. So what happens is whales will die and they roll up on the beach, big, nasty, rotting thing. And a fellow out in Hawaii will get a phone call that says, hey, you want this? And they'll tie a big rope around the stern of it, and they'll drag it out, and they'll let it drop in a spot. And then we get to go dive on it. Now, this is what it looks like after it's gotten in a good state. But I have other images of what it looks like when it's decomposing, covered with hagfish. And we go there with a giant bread knife and cut giant pieces of dead blubber off, bring it to the surface. And you should see what that's like when you bring the sub up and there's nasty, rotting whale smell everywhere. But the reason we do this is that when a whale dies and falls, it's got all that blubber and it creates a local environment that's very unique. And all sorts of interesting animals populate this thing. So it's a great source of energy for these animals. And over time, this is what they turn into. This is a mosaic that was actually done with Alvin, flying over this whale carcass after it's all fully decomposed. And then someone knitted the images together. So we've been down there, and the big sharks will roll in when the nasty rotting whale you'll be hanging out. And there's some great footage of some of these sharks coming in, grabbing a hold of this nasty old dead whale. And to them, it's tasty. To you and me, it is foul. But we got time for a few more questions if you guys have anything else you want to ask. Right here in front.
Considering the level of knowledge of Jules Verne, why do you think he picked 20,000 leagues? Isn't that a bit out of reach?
So that's a great question. So that's a distance, not a depth. So he was describing the travels of the submarine, basically. And the 20,000 leagues was, and I asked that question too once upon a time. I'm like, wait a minute, what's he talking about, right? He's really talking about distance.
The current version of the Alvin reminds me of the story of the world's oldest axe, which has had the handle replaced 7 times and the head 3 times. Are there any parts of the Alvin which actually date back to 50 years ago?
This is a great question. And you know, I've searched high and low for the answer to that, and I think I've got it, okay? So the sub that we took apart, at one point in time, I believe the oldest piece on the sub was this flat deck that was on the top of the hull, and that's now with the old hull. And at that point, I was convinced that the oldest portions of the submarine were portions of a ballast system which run late 60s. So I don't think there's anything from day one. But if it's not those parts which have been remade, kind of like Frankenstein, right? We use these devices to drop the ballast steel that when we descend, we have steel on the sub, and when we want to come home, we pitch the weights. And these little solenoid devices, little electromagnets that help us hold the weight on, have been made by a fellow locally here for years. And I finally came across one that's been around since 1972. And it still works. Hard to believe, right? This is some quality stuff, right? And it's not currently on the submarine, I know, because we took it off. But at that point in time, I thought that was the oldest piece. So right now, there's a couple of pieces of the ballast system I suspect that are older. But in the grand scheme of things, I think half of some of the oldest stuff is probably late 80s, early 90s. So yeah, it's a concept that's moved along, right? I think probably we should go find the oldest piece we can get, little thing, and just put it on there as a good luck charm, you know, and just then we always have that one original piece, right?
Two quick questions for you. One is, you mentioned you've been over 300 dives. I imagine every dive is logged. Do you know about how many dives Alvin has done?
Yeah, actually, today's dive number is in the neighborhood of probably getting close to maybe 4,730-ish. So yes, every dive is logged, and if you want to see about every dive, you can go online and find the dive log. You can see who was there. And like I said, there's a thing called the frame grabber, which takes still images of the video cameras that are being used and then knits it together and builds a file. And you can actually go online and pick any dive. And what you're going to find is you're going to see a lot of the same stuff. So for every 100 pictures taken, then you're going to see something really cool. And then you'll see a whole row of really cool things. But that's all right on public domain. You can go right on Hui's website and you can look back. You can find the Titanic dives and see when they were. So there's a lot of history of the submarine online that's available for people to look at. But every dive is logged. And I can tell you that for every hour of underwater, there's at least 3 to 4 hours of paper added on top of that, on average.
The other quick question, I noticed you had like milk crates in one of your pictures with
science
stuff.
Is,
How
yes.
do you surface items from the bottom? Are there containers on the end? Or?
This is a great question. So milk crates are like de facto one of the best science sampling tools ever made because they're easy, cheap. We buy them. We don't steal them anymore. People steal them from us, right? You can drill them, you can cut them, you can do all sorts of things. They're great for rocks. They're great for putting tools in. The standard milk crate is 12 by 12 or 12 by 18 and makes a great platform. You can sit there and measure things out. And they really work great. When you want to bring an animal to the surface, traditionally what you want to do is keep it as close to the environment it came from. So we build insulated boxes at the seal. Some of the boxes that people bring out are real high tech. There are even ones that keep them under pressure, which you can imagine if you have a box and you put something in it at depth and you close it, seal it, and you bring it to the surface, you now have a bomb. So it has to be tested. Literally, you have a pressurized container. So we want to keep these animals insulated. When you come up to the surface, you traditionally put the arms on top of these boxes to hold them closed because the sub is moving around in the water. When you take sediment samples, you do it with tube cores, which is one of the simplest devices you've ever seen. It's a tube with a little valve on the top that just flaps. You push it in, you can grab the mud. We take complicated devices out there that are mind-blowing. We bring mass spectrometers. The basket, the primitive thing you see in the basket milk crates, we have people who design and build instruments that are super unique, either to get an animal or to sample the animal in its environment. We have this great thing called a Bushmaster, and maybe I can bring a picture of it up. This is developed by Chuck Fisher from Penn State. He is a biologist that wanted to get everything that was associated with a clump of tube worms. So he conceived of this thing. It looks like an umbrella. And you can put it over the tube worms and you can hydraulically close it. So you capture everything in there. And if you do it right, you pick it up and you carry all this stuff to the surface. And they get every animal that was on that tube worm when you bring it up. So he built one that was about this big. And he said, well, that's cool. I can make one smaller. And then he made one that's almost as big as Ken. And we've never had that on Alvin. They've had it out on the Johnson ceiling. But it's the big Bushmaster, as they call this thing. And it is massive, right? You could literally, he could probably stand in it. And you can imagine it looks like something out of a little shop of horrors. So that's an example of a tool that we'll use.
I can imagine that everybody who wants to study the ocean would like to go on an Alvin mission or have Alvin do some of their work. How do you decide where you're going to go, who you're going to take, and what projects are viable either short-term or long-term for what you're going to do with limited resources?
Well, the good news is I don't have to make that decision. But what happens is a person or a group of scientists will conceive of an idea or something they're either presently studying or they see a desire to go to a particular place and study. And they'll write a proposal to, traditionally, the National Science Foundation. It'll go through peer review and get funded. And then they'll collaborate with another group of scientists. Remember, Andy said that there were about 50 people on board. Half of those are scientists. There's about 25 people on board the ship. Traditionally, they come from a number of different universities, and they all work together, and they have a particular interest in a particular site. When we dive later this year down along the ridge axes, we'll have people that are doing all sorts of different science working together because it's the site that they want to go to. So after about a year and a half, if they get funded, one of them will get picked as the chief scientist. And they're the ones between their colleagues and the other principal investigators who will handpick the folks that are coming out with them. So a handful of them are older scientists who are in their careers, newer scientists that are on postdocs, and then a number of undergraduates will come out. And they'll all work together during the cruise, and that whole process starts way before we ever get out to sea. And they define the work that they're going to do, and then they will work with myself and other people here, and when we're out on the ship, ahead of time to plan all the experiments. They draft up a straw dive plan, and then out at sea, once everybody arrives, we kind of review everything. The chief scientist picks the scientists who will be in the submarine. As the expedition leader, I would pick who is the pilot, and I also get to schedule the training dives. And then the night before a dive, we have a meeting at about 6:30 where the folks that were in the vehicle that particular day will come and tell us about what they saw and did. And the folks that are going the next day will be there, and they'll take what they heard. They'll look at a dive plan that's on paper that's sort of a bullet list of what we want to do to review the process so we know we got a good plan in place. Because on average, you get 6 hours. And you notice he didn't eat lunch, right? It's not because we just don't stop. You get down to the bottom and you work, and then bang, dive's over, you got to come home. So it's very collaborative well before they ever get out there. You know, we want to establish what it is that they want to do. We want to get to know their science. We want to look at the equipment, because I can tell you that if we're not directly involved in the experiments, the devices that arrive are unique, is the word I would use. I've heard the word 8th grade science project, right? Because when you're on a budget, you're going to cook up some interesting things. Like a perfect example is when we dive in the Gulf of Mexico, we go to places where gas is coming out of the bottom. And if you capture the gas, it actually will form ice. It'll form frozen water with the methane inside of it. And we try to capture this stuff. And at one point, somebody come out, and it literally looked like they'd gone to Walmart, and we had duct tape, and we had RTV, and we had a couple of funnels, and just this thing was all kludged together. And when they handed it to us, we realized it wasn't going to work. So we adjusted it. But the whole process to get from the desire to go to the actual dive is probably 2 years. So right now, people writing proposals will probably end up at soonest diving in 2017, 16 to 17. But again, I'm glad I don't have to pick who goes into the submarine when it comes from science, because if there's 12 dives, 2 of which are training seats, they're going to not have enough seats for people. So there's always 1 or 2 people on a cruise who don't get a chance to dive. And that's always kind of a bummer.
Have you ever felt in danger on a dive?
Well, no, not personally. So one of the things that, I mentioned that we do a lot of paperwork for the dives. And a lot of that is the maintenance on the vehicle. We're constantly doing maintenance. I wouldn't get in the submarine, frankly, if I didn't think it was safe. And the only time I've ever had anything happen that was dramatic, it was fairly routine. We had a minor problem that required us to abort the dive and come home. But in the grand scheme of things, nothing super ugly. Maybe surprising for a half a moment. And we like to keep it that way. We figure almost 5,000 dives. What's key here, though, is that Andy mentioned this. There's 6 people out there right now that take care of that sub, including some support that are here. But on average, there's 5 to 6 folks out there working that submarine. And they're the ones who make the decisions to keep it safe. And they're the ones who perform the work. And without the sort of focus and attention that they give, it wouldn't be as reliable as it is. So, and I know I've been out there with them, and we hold a high standard. If we hire a person who doesn't have the kind of care that we require, we will not let them work on the submarine. So the good news is that no, nothing really dramatic has happened. Someone stole my cookies once. They took the chocolate chip cookies out of my lunch, which is a big deal when you're down there, right? You're looking forward to chocolate chip cookies, and then you don't get them. Kind of sets the stage, right? I guess we got a few more minutes, and then we'll get like 2 more questions and call it done.
So in the classical submarine dives, they hang up a clothesline and then watch the clothesline sag as they go deep. I imagine your craft goes through a lot of expansion and contraction. What is the criteria for determining whether you've fatigued the metal so much that it's time to retire it?
Well, this is a good question. So that all started with the design of the new hull. And I suspect that if we put a string, like what he's talking about, by the way, is an old submariner's trick, right? Put a string up between the hull, and when you go down, all of a sudden it's not tight anymore, right? And then you bring the new guy in and go, right? The hull definitely changes dimensions when we go deep. I've never put a string up because, frankly, it's not the kind of thing I want to do. The last thing I want is to spook someone that's stuck in a 6-foot sphere for a couple of hours. That's probably not a good thing. The design of the hull took into account the modeling of how it would change over time, this idea of cycling the thing and making it bigger and smaller. So it actually has a specific number of dives it's allowed to do at its max depth, which we don't go to all the time. So we've got this log, and the other thing is that every 5 years when we bring it back in, we examine all the welds. All the places that are most likely to have problems, we actually inspect them, we do radiography, and we do ultrasound on them. So the hull is a big deal to us. When it was finished, it went through a pressure cycling, a suite of tests in Annapolis, where it was brought up well above the depth we would ever go to. And it was instrumented with strain gauges that measured how it changed. And it was fairly impressive. I mean, I've got the data, and I've just started to look it over. But to put it in perspective, so we measured this thing, the sphericity of the thing, before we went through these tests, and then we measure it afterwards. And it changed. You can see the difference. But again, if you look at the whole outside of that big sphere, there are only 2 spots that are out of sphericity by like 30,000ths of an inch. And remember, we had a plus or minus 1/8 of an inch tolerance. So theoretically, you could change sphericity by 1/4 of an inch. So the amount that it's out of tolerance after it was pressure cycled was almost nothing. So it all came down to design. And this goes back to what he asked, right? There's people building subs out of glass right now that are interesting, right? Glass is a wonderful thing until it isn't. And it does that, like, it'll go from really great to really not great, right? The nice thing about metal is metal doesn't, it can do this. I've got an image, I don't have it here, of what happens when you stress a piece of titanium past its limit, and it shattered. This is a tube. Unfortunately, it was tested to the wrong pressure, and it proved the design by doing it. It proved the design by failure. So the engineers got it right. The people running the test didn't. But here's where a piece of metal shattered like a piece of glass, and it was an eye-opener for us. But the hull is well designed. It's got a safety factor of about 24%. And the reason it's 24% is because the only pressure facility on the planet that can go up that high, we took it right to its limit. There's nothing else, and we couldn't get it any higher than that. And there's great images online of the sphere being placed in that pressure chamber. And it's impressive because if you find that picture, it's online, right? You'll see the brand new sphere getting stuck in this big chamber. Take a look at that picture and then think this. When Alvin got its first new sphere back in the 70s, Barry would know about this, they put it in the chamber with people, sealed it up, and they did a dive. And evidently, there's a backstory to this. They randomly got some guy, some Navy guy, and they're like, "Tag, you're it. You're going in." And while they were in, one of the lights imploded. And needless to say, once he got out of there, he wasn't exactly happy. But when you see this image, they took the sail of the sub off. There's a great picture of it down at the facility, and they stuck it in there. And nice thing about diving in open water, there's always that up. But when you're stuck in a chamber, where are you going to go? That's kind of totally weird. You're inside of a submarine, inside of a chamber. You want to talk about claustrophobia, right? So we got one more, and then we'll call it. How about this fellow in the back here?
What was your favorite dive?
Oh boy, here we go. This is a good one. So I think that's a great question because it implies that there's only one that could be the best, right? There's a whole different, if you look at this from different points of view. So my first dive alone was great. When they finally let me do it by myself, that was a great experience because I'd finally achieved the authority to take people down on my own, and that was memorable. It wasn't a very good dive, but it was a good experience. We did a series of dives along the Mid-Atlantic, and this is a great story. If you give me a second, I'll show you a picture. We had gone out with a bunch of geologists. As you now know, geologists are very engaging. he saw a fish, right? I was hoping that Keir would do a little bit more than that. Anyway, so we were diving on the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, and the intent of the series was to look at rocks that were associated with the mantle, which is subsurface, that had been exposed. And we found that. Just give me 1 second and I'll have this up. And while we were working, at night we were towing a camera around. And the camera was taking pictures of sites that we were intending to dive on the very next day. And one night, the camera saw something that nobody expected, which was pretty exciting. And nobody knew what it was. And it turned out it was something that no one had ever seen. See if I can find it. Here we go. So here's where we were. This is the middle of the Atlantic. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge is here. This is a dog leg for some reason, and it transform fault. And right here on the corner is a big mountain. This is a 14,000-foot tall mountain from bottom to top. So you can see all the way down here is 5,300 meters, and all the way up at the top, it's about 500 meters deep. So this is this big piece of rock that's been peeled off. We were towing a camera up and down here, and the idea was we were looking for places to dive. And one night, come on now, this is what we saw. And one of the engineers that was running the camera said, that's important, that's different. So the very next day, Pat went down, and I got lucky to dive there as well the day after. So this is what we were looking for and found. And this is what we ended up finding that day. And this was an area that no one had ever conceived of, knew nothing about. And these are great big tall white structures that are peeling out of the side of the top of this mountain. And look at the size of that thing. So that's an image of the size of Alvin relative to this structure. It's bright white, and it is really impressive to see. You can't see the color in this image. You can see it coming up. We did a film that has some really good footage of this. If you guys go to Netflix and find this movie, Volcanoes of the Deep Sea, you will see these images. And they are bright white. So out of the blue, first off, nobody knew what it was. And this was a fun cruise. The geologists were doing a nice job and everything, but to be there and to be a part of this and watch these people, their career in some cases took a complete right-hand turn. There's a gal out at Dr. Deb Kelly out in the University of Washington. This event drove her career in a different direction. And to be a person who was taking them down there, to be a part of that was awesome. So it was a great experience. But that's one of my favorites. Another one of my favorites is an old airplane that's off of San Diego that we go dive on. And that's just a generally fun dive. I mean, you get to go land on this airplane. If I can show you it. Come on now. I don't know if I have it in here. Anyways, it's an airplane that the poor fellow who was flying it probably was unhappy because he wasn't over in the war. He was flying a mail carrier. And on top of that, they gave it a good old lucky 13. And then to add insult to injury, it promptly ran out of gas and he had to ditch. So the plane is down at the bottom. He lived. But we've landed on this to use it as a target. And it's really fun to dive on. It's covered with sponges. And you can actually park on the wing and look right in. So those are fun. I would say every dive I've ever done has been a great experience. And you know, now that I'm back on land, I'm still going to go dive. They're not going to take that away from me until they drag me away from that thing. Because it's really a lot of fun. So I think that's it for today, guys. I really appreciate your time. I'm glad you enjoyed it. It's kind of cool to talk to yourself.
Thanks, Bruce.
To learn more about Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, visit us on the web at www.whoi.edu.